On today's episode, I have my good buddy Jackie Sanders join the show. Jackie has both military and civilian experience and really just an all around great story. Learned how to fly in the military and then actually transitioned over to the civilian world, first in ag and then air medical, and then actually a combination of ag and air medical, kind of doing both. A couple of years ago, Jackie was in an R-66 accident while flying ag. So we talk about that, kind of dissect a little bit just the entire scenario. So really fascinating. I really appreciate Jackie for many reasons, but ultimately I really appreciate that he comes on, shares not only his vast experience, but also is willing to talk about the wire strike accident he had. So this is an episode that you're not going to want to miss. Jackie's a great guy, and this is just an awesome podcast. So I hope you enjoy. How's it going? It's Halsey Scheider with the Helicopter Podcast. Thank you so much for joining us on another episode. We're trying to get them out every week. I think I'm doing it. It's been my goal. I think was around March. I was like, I need to start doing podcasts every week, every Tuesday, and I've been doing it. I've been doing it because you guys are listening. I'm getting feedback. You guys are messaging me on Instagram, and I'm loving it. So please keep doing that. If this is your first time listening to the Helicopter Podcast, make sure you go back and check out all of our episodes. I think by the time this one airs, we'll probably be somewhere in the mid 30s. So that's pretty cool. Also, please subscribe, review, and share. Today is a special episode. I should try to podcast with people I don't know more, but it's just so hard when I have so many great friends that are awesome people within this industry. And today's guest, Jackie Sanders, is one of those friends. Very impressive resume and just a down to earth, solid dude. Jackie, welcome to the show. How are you?
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm doing great. How have you been? It's been
Yeah, I'm good, man. I'm real good. The last time I think I was doing a podcast with my neighbor like 3 or 4 years ago. Didn't I have you on as a guest then too?
yeah, yeah. It was
I mean,
that's what I was thinking this morning. I was kind of going through notes and everything this morning. It's about probably closer to 4 years ago.
that's crazy. You're like the guy that just keeps giving, man. I love it. Yeah, that was my old neighbor. Ironically enough, was a guy named Jerry Clayton in Texas, and he was a famous radio personality in San Antonio. Kind of famous for flying a Cessna over the traffic, like in the '90s, and giving his traffic report. And the guy has like the perfect radio voice, and he has like a big studio at his house, and so we were trying to put something together, but it's kind of too hard with two people, like coordinating schedule, even though he didn't really work. But anyway, long story short, thanks for joining that podcast. But super excited to have you on here. I met Jackie how many years ago now, Jackie? Did you start at Air Evac?
6 years. So it'd been about 6 years ago.
So you and I met 6 years ago. That's crazy. So you've made it 6 years so far, Air Medical. Seems like you like it. I only lasted a couple years. And actually, we had a panel interview that came out a couple weeks ago. And one of the topics that we talked about was night hitch for Air Medical. What is Jackie Sanders' wisdom on night shift?
Um, so the night shift is either uh, the best thing or the worst thing. And I say that because I live around 45 minutes from my base. So it's actually a great thing for me. I get to come home and I always tell people I prefer the night hitch because I have a few hours of flexibility during the day to kind of do daily activities, go to the bank, get a haircut, that kind of stuff. But if you're a guy that commutes to your base and stays there all week, it's the worst thing because you're up during the day sitting around the base or in a town you're not familiar with, or no one that you know except the people you work with, just twiddling your thumbs and kind of making up stuff to do. So those guys typically don't like it that well.
Yeah, that's how my first base was. After you and I did training together, um, I went to Del Rio on the border, and that's exactly what it was like. I would have to kind of be stuck in this town for 7 or 8 days at a time. And credit to Air Evac for providing base housing, but let's be honest, it's not the greatest accommodations. It's
No,
heavily dependent on the other people that are using it. And unfortunately, in my scenario, didn't seem like I was ever really given much of a clean apartment, I guess. So that was
yeah.
certainly hard. What about just like the overall for you fatigue? Like, are you pretty good about getting up at 3 in the morning and being like, all right, here we go?
Yeah, so I actually did air medical about 4 years before I went to Air so I've been doing it around 10 years now. And I've learned that the trick is you just take like your normal human circadian rhythm and biology and you just toss that out the window and then you'll be fine. Uh, so yes, so for some people, I guess they call it sleep inertia is
Hey,
worse
real
than
fast,
others.
are you clicking a pen on me over there, Jackie?
Yes, I didn't realize it was that sensitive. All right. So,
It's very sensitive. I can just hear my editor now. I have a gal. Her name is Annie. She helps edit these. And the other day, I was doing a podcast, and I have a bad habit of like putting a lot of ice in my water, and then after the water's gone, I'm like chewing on the ice, and I'm like, I thought I had it all like kind of set up. I would be like, and then kind of like step away, and she calls me. She goes, were you chewing on ice? And I'm like, yeah, I was chewing
you're
on
like,
ice.
okay, that's kind of a
So,
personal question, but yeah.
so anyway, when I heard the pen. It's all good. So yeah, I forgot that you were in the hospital wing. You're in the H-130 in the
Yep.
Tennessee area, correct?
Yeah, in the Memphis area. Yep.
And so I mean, you're a guy that shows up to your air medical base. Do you sleep at night then, or do you just, like you said, toss it out the window and just stay up?
Uh, so once again, there's kind of two methodologies there. Some people will come in and they'll treat it like a night shift factory job, and they'll stay up the entire 12 hours night shift, looking at the weather, running laps around the base, whatever, trying to stay awake. I, I'm more in the camp of I come in and, 10:30, 11 or so, I go to sleep and usually I can get a couple hours of sleep or, sometimes you're fortunate you sleep throughout the night, but I guess just over 10 years, I've got used to if you have to get up at 3 o'clock in the morning, like I said, you just have to deal with that like shift work,
Yep. You got to
kind of
put your
stuff. That's,
your big boy pants on.
yeah, sometimes.
And I didn't want to be a big boy. I guess I honestly I hated getting up. It was so difficult for me, and it wasn't even like a thing where I was like, oh my god, I'm so tired. Sometimes I was, but it was mainly just like an anger of knowing that the next day that I was going to be like just wiped.
Oh yeah,
Like I just couldn't get this little rage out of my head of like, oh damn it, I'm going to just
there's
feel like poop
there's
tomorrow.
nothing worse. There's nothing worse than like the 2 or 2:30 a.m. flight because you're going to get back just in enough time to get off work, and like you said, deal with. Now you have a day to deal with where you got up at 2:30 in the morning you know for whatever reason.
Yeah, it's just
So so if any, if
unnatural.
anybody so if anybody wants the experience, just this morning, just randomly set an alarm to get up at 2:30 in the morning and just kind of stay up all day and see how that works out.
Yeah, see how it feels. We
Yeah.
should have I think air medical executive teams should experience that five times in a row in a week. I
Yeah.
don't know. I think it's a problem, Jackie. I really do. I think that the industry should look at it. I'm surprised that there's not more accidents. Um, Going crazy with that pen, bro. Dude, you're just like me.
I'm
Are
I'm gonna
are you a fidgeter?
I'm gonna swap to a pencil.
You,
I, I, I,
do we need to tape your hands?
I'm gonna try it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm a
So what you're
fidgeter.
saying, yeah, me too. What you're saying about the like leadership, kind of living that role. I have like an interesting take on that, and not to say who or where or what timeline, but at a pilot at my base one time that he got into like there's acute fatigue and chronic fatigue. So he got into like a chronic fatigue scenario where the individual flight uh, that night was not the problem. It was the summation of the 3 days or 3 nights leading up to that. He'd had 3 nights in a row where he'd got the 2:30 in the morning, didn't get to good sleep during the day. He stayed at the base, like you said, which is not the most conducive environment for resting with the helicopter taking off and landing all day and people running around the base, slamming doors and stuff. Um, so on like the third or fourth night in a row, uh, he just kind of called it and said, "Hey, we gotta set this one out. Like we're all too tired." And there was just a little bit of dishonesty in there between how it got conveyed, to the dispatch because nobody really wanted to say they were tired. And anyway, he ends up getting in a little bit of trouble for it. He gets a write up for it, not because he did the right thing by saying he was too tired, um, but the way they went about it as a crew, you know, and during the um, kind of mentoring process and him getting, kind of getting wrote up and that kind of stuff, he brought up the fact that, humans aren't nocturnal animals. So it's not normal to be up at 2 in the morning. I was kind of joking about the circadian rhythm a while ago, but that, it's a real thing.
Totally.
So, yeah. And then he pointed out the fact that, on our company risk assessment, for the company I was working for, the company risk assessment has a risk assessment value assigned for flights between, like midnight and 6 in the morning. He was like, why would you have that on your risk assessment? Because they were kind of getting onto the guy and saying, hey, there's no difference between flying at 2 in the morning and 2 at night. You should be resting. If you're on night shift, you should be resting during the day. And he kind of pointed out, well, why do you have this risk assessment category for flights that occur between 12 and 6? It's like obviously somebody out there in the world has put the data together and determined that there is more of a risk to flying at 2 in the morning instead of 2 in the afternoon. So
Yeah, I mean, I think you know, I kind of side with your guy there. I was in his situation. I've had that where it's cumulative, right? Where it's like Monday night flight, Tuesday night flight. When and it's just like you feel like you can't escape it. Where you have other weeks where you literally it's the best job because you sleep all night and you get paid and nothing happens. But
yeah,
those back to back to back to back to nights can really exhaust you. And for me, I am not a day sleeper. I could be up most of all night and I get home and I just lay there. Nothing happens.
yeah,
I blacked out my room. I put the eye mask on, and my body I think is maybe just extra sensitive, of like. And then the other actually weird thing about me, lots of weird things, but one of one of many for the night shift is I would anticipate that tone going off, and that would make it very hard for me to fall asleep. So there could be nights where we didn't get toned at all, but who laid there all night long waiting to get toned? This guy. And so,
yeah.
like, I would self induce not sleeping all night. And so my cumulative effect would add up whether we flew or we didn't fly. The only nights that I actually got truly good rest is if the aircraft was down for maintenance or the weather.
The single worst thing you can do as an EMS pilot is tell your spouse that you're allowed to sleep at work because they assume you're getting 8 to 10 to 12 hours of quality sleep every
Qualities.
shift, every sleep, or every shift. And my wife's great about it. Like we talked about offline, she's a night shift nurse, so she totally gets it. But in our infancy of me working EMS, it was just like, when I would have a night where I'm out all night, I would come home and it's like Well, you were on night shift last night, so you slept all night, right? No. Or well, the weather was bad, so you got to sleep last night, right? No, that's not how that works. I'm in a in a small twin bed in a dorm room essentially.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Yeah, the accommodations are not always the best. And then, for the company that I worked at, um, as you're familiar with, is they tone whether the weather is good or bad, right?
oh
And
yeah.
I felt like in South Texas, especially, there would be some hospitals that thought it was a game. Like, we're just going to call over and over and over and over again. So, I mean, I think my record one time was, I think 8 or 9 turn downs from the same
Yeah.
hospital within like an 8 hour shift.
Yeah, you definitely get more when the weather's bad because nobody's taking calls. So you get your normal ones, and then you get ones from services that never call, or some hospitals and ambulance services that never call you because their normal guy's not answering, or the normal guy turned it down. So they'll say, "Hey, we'll call that company and see if they'll take it." Not
Yeah.
understanding that nobody can do it, but they'll just, like you said, they just call and call and call. So, like you said, even on weather nights, you just sit there and answer the radio all night.
Yep. It's kind of like the gift that keeps on giving. But I don't want to get too in the weeds of my thoughts on EMS night shift. I think it's not for everyone, but you can make it happen. I would suggest that if you want to do a bunch of like daytime work, because I was kind of a busy body during the day. I was starting my helicopter brokerage when I was doing air medical. I don't think that helped because I felt like I had to do things during the day. So just keep that in mind if you are wanting to get into air medical. One of the awesome things about Jackie, many awesome things, but is your resume. You have an incredible pilot resume. I'm going to see if I can get it right and then tell me where I messed up. So, Blackhawks for the Army, Lakotas for the Guard, Ag flying, multiple airframes, primarily, I guess, 44, 66. Um, Obviously, 206 for helicopter, for the air ambulance, and airplanes. Did I get them all?
Yeah, the H-130 there at
Oh,
Hospital
of
Wing,
course. Of
and
course.
then yeah, I think that about hits it. That's about all of it.
That's it.
Yeah, and then so just credentials just for the ATP helicopter and CFI double I helicopter and airplane and A&P mechanic.
Yeah, so I mean, you're stacked. I mean, your resume is incredible, and you have the knowledge to back it. I remember when we were together in training. It's like a month long. And it's kind of like a little band of brothers, um, because you become close with the guys that you're training with. And I felt like everyone in
Yeah,
our training course was pretty cool. And I remember you specifically being like the guy. Not only did you have the past air medical experience, but you just had so much aviation knowledge. I could be like, "Hey, Jackie, like, what does this mean?" And you're like, "Oh, this blah blah blah." And I'm like, "Oh, good." So I think you kind of
yeah.
helped me get through. So I appreciate that. So is your first flying experience then when you started in the army?
Yes, yeah. I didn't. I went to Army flight school when I was 20. Yeah, I turned 21 in flight school, so I went when I was 20. So I didn't really have any experience. Well, I did one enlistment as a mechanic, which is where the mechanic experience comes from. But essentially, to make it a very condensed version, got out of high school, went to the Army, did an overseas tour as a mechanic, came back and went directly to flight school, and then I've kind of been just flying ever since then. But that was my first exposure to flying in the front seat as a pilot. Because as a mechanic, I did eventually transfer over to the crew chief role and did some backseat flying in a Black Hawk, but that was it.
But actually, like being the guy, I'm
Yeah,
curious. Obviously, I went the civilian route, but I'm sure a lot of our listeners are probably interested in going the army route. I mean, who doesn't want to fly Blackhawk? Seems pretty cool to me. Uh, what does that training program look like? You're a guy that I feel like is also very entwined with what civilian flying is all about. So obviously you're
Yeah.
fixed wing training. So I feel like if anyone kind of can really compare apples to apples between military training and civilian, it would be you. Would you kind of give me your thoughts and feedback on kind of like what to expect for Army flight training?
Yeah. So as it's well known, the Army or the military as a whole, aviation side is a very robust training program. And I like to tell people that, we know that civilian companies at the end of the road, they operate to make a dollar, to make money. So most all commercial companies operate to make money. The Army, besides their obvious mission of, war and homeland protection and that kind of stuff, they operate for training, I like to say. So, like, that's their everything they do is training for that next event they're going to deploy for. So, that if you're not downrange deployed, Iraq, Afghanistan, where we happen to be in the world at the time, you're training. And so you go in for, imagine your 12-hour shifts at AirEvac not being tailored around flying patients, but being tailored around getting in the books, going out and doing training missions, traffic patterns, all that stuff. So that's kind of what the stateside, that's what the Army operates for, is training. So you get tons of it, and it's a lot of getting real deep in the weeds on topics that the civilian side doesn't have the time to or even care to do. Because it's like, there's a lot of sitting around the round table playing stump the chump on, oh, I know this, minutia that's, in between this paragraph and this chapter in this book, and everybody else don't, you know. So that's where, like, you reference back to at our EMS training. I just had lots of random knowledge about that kind of stuff, and that's where it comes from. Is not, not having anything to do except, find something in some book somewhere that somebody else doesn't know. Um,
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like you guys are constantly. So it's almost like, like you said, private civilian companies have to have a training budget, and hopefully it's a decent sized budget, but it's still a budget. Whereas like the purpose of the military is to spend the money, In fact, I think right sometimes you have to, you know, if the budget's coming on a little light, you're encouraged to go and spend more money,
yeah,
type of situation. What about like going back to actual just ab initio flight training? Like, what is that like compared to, say, what you did civilian wise for airplane?
yeah. So it's about an 18 to 20 month process, depending on a lot of different factors. And you start out with kind of some, let's just call it professional development training that has nothing to do with flying. Your officer training, that kind of stuff, and that's a couple months of it. Then once you get into the flying portion, um, let me gather where I was talking about there. So when you get into the flying portion, it's more like it's kind of like a college environment. You're 8 to 10 to 12 hour days sometimes, academics all morning. So you may go in at 7 or 8 in the morning and do academics till noon and take a break. And then you go out to the flight line in the afternoon and spend, from like 1 to 5 or 6 flying. And then ever so often they'll rotate. So everybody's not flying solely in the morning or solely in the afternoon kind of thing. And that's kind of how it operates. So it's more like a college environment. There's a de facto classroom. You go in, professor sitting there, everybody sitting there taking notes, laptops, slideshows, PowerPoints, that kind of stuff. So it's kind of split up between the two, and that's kind of the theme throughout. Which is, I feel like you don't get that doing civilian training because it's a lot more one on one. So the Army, at least the ground training, is way more structured because they're presenting that to 30, 40, 50 people at a time. Whereas when I do flight training with a student in the civilian world, it's typically just me and that person one on one, with sitting there with a far aim and, me with my notes. you typically don't have a grand production unless you're at a bigger flight school. Some of those bigger flight schools may do that, but you're definitely not getting that in Part 61 training.
Yeah,
Um,
I mean, it's excuse me. Yeah, like yeah, it's not. It's almost like you said. It's like a college course, really. It's
yeah.
like you're going to a college lab. That's designed. And I went to a large flight school. I think when I was going to Hillsborough, I mean, it was one of the largest helicopter schools. But even then, it was still very one on one, and it's profit driven. So it's kind of like I think flight schools want their students to not necessarily do great all the time. I don't think my school that I went to intentionally tried to sabotage that. Uh, but with the Army, there's like consequences, right? If you're not meeting the bar.
Oh, yeah, for sure. It's once again back to the college environment. You have a GPA to maintain. You have certain benchmark tests that are, must pass, or you don't move on to the next phase. But just to uh, backtrack to one thing, like back to the civilian training, it's like on the civilian side, everything comes down to money. So uh, if I were to tell a student, let's pretend I've got a 21, 22-year-old guy that's going to get into doing this for a living. If I were to tell him, hey, you have to pay me 50, 60, $70 an hour for 5 hours a day for us to sit here and just talk about the FAR aim or talk about weather, that guy would quickly run out of financial backing, unless he's just, independently wealthy or something. But most people can't do that. And that's where, like I said, the Army operates for training specifically. They've got the one instructor up there that, let's pretend they're paying $50 an hour teaching 40 students. Uh, so that's kind of it, it all kind of boils back to money on the civilian side and not so much on the Army side, because like you said, they'll just request more money next year.
Yeah, there's no shortage. Well, I think there's a big shortage, but it seems like it keeps coming. So,
Yeah.
and I'm actually a proponent of, I think to be a leading nation, you have to have a powerful military. And
Yeah.
so, I personally believe that we should have lots of money going to the military, which I think we do. I'm not super actually well versed in it, but I definitely support the spending. I support the training. Um, the flying is very different. I remember flying with, and something that I admired about you, excuse me, when we were in flight training or the company training together, was you didn't necessarily come in. I mean, granted, you had been flying civilian air medical for 4 years already at that point, but it didn't seem like you came into that civilian job with like, oh, well, in the Army, we did it this way, or in the Black Hawk, it was this way. And I had personally experienced that in my flight school days. I would occasionally get the Black Hawk guard pilot that would come in, excuse me, and, want to be flying the R-22. And, well, in the Black Hawk, we don't have to do that. It's like, well, yeah, but this is an R-22. You definitely, we want to land into the wind with the R-22. We don't want a 20 knot tailwind, and it's these just things, So, do you think that some military pilots have a hard time transitioning to civilian? What are some of the hurdles, and what would be your advice for those guys that might be listening to the show, or gals that are maybe transitioning out of military flying and coming into the civilian world?
Yeah. So one thing I was going to piggyback on there is quantity of training does not equal quality of training. So just because you've done, I always like to rib Army guys, and because I've been there, I know the deal. So I always tell them, you'll get a guy that's like, oh, I've got 2,000 flight hours, and I'll say, no, you've got 1 hour 2,000 times. Because you fall a lot into the just going out and doing the same thing, the same flight. Like because the Army, and it's not to their fault. It's like the Army likes to paint you into a box and say, hey, this is the box you're allowed to operate in. Don't get outside of it, because if you get outside of it, I have to start, doing risk assessments. And basically, if you want to go outside of the box and create some sort of new training or new event, it causes other people to have to work, and they're not as motivated about it as you are. So they're just like, hey, here's your box, stay in this box, and everything's fine. So, like I said, I joke with them and say, you end up doing the same 1 hour flight 2,000 times. Whereas, with the air medical stuff or ag stuff, long line and whatever, it's like every day is a new day kind of thing. Something else to figure out, some other curveball thrown at you. And in the military, this is the biggest thing I would say. The military, everything is there's 27 people involved in how you're going to land at an LZ, and there's the safety guy to talk to, the tactical guy to talk to, the instructors to talk to, the commander. 27 people have their hands on how you're going to land, and do your approach and all that stuff. And then the kind of the culture shock is when you get out and you go to air evac, they give you like three parameters and they say, hey, land at this LZ and stay inside these three parameters. Anything outside of that is you're the PIC, figure it out. So that's
Yeah,
kind of the culture shock that military guys have.
yeah, it's like, it's I mean, everything about the government is bureaucracy, so I can only imagine it's kind of that same, like you said, 27 people telling you, how to land the
Yeah.
helicopter.
What
And
it,
and not, not to take away, obviously, military pilots are fantastic pilots, and they make great military pilots, and they make, great civilian pilots. But I do know, and I've seen it firsthand, some guys don't adapt as well as others.
yeah. I always tell people, I get the question a lot, what do who's better, military or civilian? And there's neither one. They both have their own strengths and weaknesses. And just kind of a funny story about the culture shock. My kind of first job, I did ag for a little while to build some time, but like my first Part 135 job, of course, was air medical, and it was at a smaller company that didn't have a very robust training program. It was more of a one-on-one training kind of thing, and that's kind of when I got that culture shock of like, we went to our first hospital we were going to land at and training, and I was kind of like, hey, where's do we have like an LZ card, or like what way do I need to land here? And the instructor is like he's an older guy, and he looks at me, he's like, I feel like that's what we pay you to figure out. He's like, probably just land into the wind. He said, if I were you, I'd probably land into the wind, but besides that, that's what I pay you for. So
That's funny. That's a good story. It's my kind of favorite civilian military comment, and I think a lot of my tour operator friends can vouch, is I worked at Maverick. I would pull a group of 7 passengers out, give them my little brief. Guaranteed, if they're Americans, the first thing that they would ask was like, "Oh, do you prior military?" And specifically at Maverick and a lot of the tour jobs, most of those guys and gals are not military. It's all civilian. It's kind of an entry level, 1,000-hour job. And so every time I would be like, no, I'm all civilian trained. You would watch their confidence in you, like, "Woo." And it's like, I would explain to them, like, hey, this is a very civilian centric job. A lot of people are getting into so it's always just kind of that funny experience of like the passengers being like, ah, oh, damn it, I really wanted a military trained guy to fly my
yeah,
Grand Canyon tour.
yeah, you're right that does come up. Every time you meet somebody, that's like the first thing they ask. And this is not to disparage the Army or military guys or training at all, but I always joke with people and I tell them like, I got my license in the military, but I learned how to fly an R-44.
Well, and
Because
you
it's like,
flying the ag certainly is the case.
yeah. So, one thing about flying in the military and Blackhawks and Apaches and Chinooks and all that stuff is as pilots, we all know, like, power can fix a lot of things. Power can make up for a lot of incompetency, you know, and that's kind of the luxury. I think one of the detriments to, if you've got 2, 3, 4,000 hours and it's all in a helicopter that has 4,000 horsepower and a 10,000 pound lifting capacity, a 10,000 pound useful load. It's like, man, and you go get in a long ranger that's at max gross weight, plus 5%, with a tail rotor that doesn't like to work all the time.
And with a
You,
torque meter that's like deep, deep,
yeah,
deep, deep,
you
deep.
you got to figure some stuff out real quick.
Yeah,
And
it's just it's a culture shock. If anything, it's like the military has the best of the best equipment. Pound for pound, and you're absolutely right. A Black Hawk, a Chinook, an attack helicopter. You could, it's there's almost so many layers of redundancy and safety and power that you got to work hard to probably really ball it up. I know it happens,
yeah,
but yeah, it's definitely a lot different than I would always get a crack up when Blackhawk
I,
guys or gals would get in the R-22. And
I, I was never an instructor in the Army, like a flight instructor, but I was a pilot in command there towards the end. So I would get to take junior guys out and get to like I would get to fly with them outside of the training environment, just two dudes going out and doing our own our own thing or whatever. So we would get guys that would go out, and we were allowed to land in confined areas out on our training area and that kind of stuff. And they would do their high recon, low recon, and then land. And I would say, man, that was a good job. Except if you didn't have 4,000 horsepower, you would have just killed us all. And they're like, well, what do you mean? And I was like, hey, do you remember like when you were coming through the treetops, you went from 60% torque to like 90%? He's like, yeah, it's kind of weird. I guess the wind was blowing. I was like, no, man, you had no airspeed, 1,500 foot per minute rate of descent, and you were landing downwind. Like you had the luxury of 4,000 horsepower to save your bacon there. And it's like never occurred to that guy until that moment. He was like, oh yeah, I guess that is textbook settling with power. You know, and I was
you're like,
like,
that's exactly
yeah,
it.
yeah, like back to like I said, like I just kind of said that to get your attention, but if we were in a Jet Ranger, you would have just killed both of us. So
Yeah, no, it's true. I mean, you can really save your bacon a lot just by the power and performance of that machine. And yeah, from the civilian world, look, I learned it in R-22, and I had some really good instructors that harped on me. Just because we have the available power for takeoff or landing doesn't mean that we should use it. And I
yeah,
thought that that was a really good transition for me going into, say, a Jet Ranger or a Long Ranger, fully loaded, where the red line actually has a consequence, whereas in the R-22 or the R-44, it really doesn't. So, learning that power management in a very, quote unquote, underpowered aircraft was really helpful. But I also argue, maybe other than Blackhawks or military helicopters, that every civilian helicopter is underpowered because you're just going to fully load it up to gross, right? And
yeah.
some do a
So
little bit better, but you're always kind of flying underpowered.
yeah, and it goes back to the dollar, like we were talking about earlier. I have a buddy that works at a program that just stepped up to an EC 145, and he's like, he's pretty excited about it. It's a cool aircraft and all that stuff. And I was like, man, you know as well as I do that aircraft it could have a usable load of 13 million pounds, and they're just going to keep putting more medical gear on it until you have a 350-pound patient weight. And he was like,
Totally.
yeah, you're right. Like if you get a new aircraft, doing any sort of civilian work, long line, air medical, whatever, they're going to just keep loading it up until you're back at max gross weight, no matter what it is.
Yeah, and it feels like an R-22 again.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, you definitely can't get yourself too amped up about like a new airframe. Like it's gonna be life changing. I mean, yeah, if you're in an H-125 by yourself, a half bag of gas, then yeah, I mean it's an incredible helicopter. You
Yeah.
know, max gross it, high DA. It's still a pretty good helicopter, but it's still going to be power limited. So, um, I want to kind of transition a little bit and talk about your ag experience. Uh, Obviously, I don't have any ag experience. I work with ag operators. I help them buy and sell helicopters. I have a couple of really good clients that are probably pretty busy right now because it's kind of in the midst of corn. What drew you to ag, and how did you kind of get your foot in the door flying ag?
Yeah. So, when you get out of flight school in the Army or whatever, and most of my time was spent in the Guard. Really, the only active duty time I had was deployments and that kind of stuff. So when I got out of Army flight school, I was returning back to my Guard unit. So I go back and I have a fresh commercial certificate with, let's say, 200 hours. But everybody out there listening can attest to how hard it is to get a job with 200 hours, you know.
Totally.
So there was I kind of went around airport shopping and just looking for stuff to do, people to, networking, because I had no prior experience in the aviation community. I was led to an ag operator in my area that flies Hueys, and I just kind of went and door knocked the guy and said, "Hey, man, like I just got out of Army flight school. I've got a mechanic certificate. That's kind of the only value I have right now. But if I could hang around here and like learn and fly with you or whatever, because it's Huey, it was dual seat, dual controls." And he kind of mentored me, took me under his wing, kind of deal. And that was my how I got into ag. Because after a few months of showing up, like I worked at the place, showing up at 6 in the morning, staying there all day, kind of thing. Because I'm young at this point, 21. Had a girlfriend that's now my wife, but no kid or anything. So I could go out there and hang out all day, fly with those guys and whatever. So after he saw my work ethic and I was actually going to show up and be an asset to somebody, he was like, "Man, we got to find you a job." And from flying with him and a little bit of Army stuff, I had like 500 or 600 hours at this point. So we found an ag operator that hired me, and that was kind of that's how I got into that whole deal. It's just for time building essentially, because once again with 600 hours, there's nowhere else that's gonna hire you unless you're CFI work or whatever. So
Yeah, and I mean, kudos to you for being young and actually going for it. I think that there's probably a lot of young people that wouldn't have just the basic, you know, intuition to show up.
yeah,
Um, that's one of those things. I mean, you wouldn't have had the opportunity if you didn't just keep showing up. They're probably kind of like, "Who is this guy?"
oh yeah,
And
I'm sure they were like, "Can somebody get this guy out of here? Like we're gonna call the cops or something. Like get out of here."
That guy doesn't have an airport badge. Who is this guy? He's some
Yeah,
weird kid. He keeps coming
yeah,
around. He says he flies Blackhawks, but I don't know.
yeah, exactly. It's like he
Yeah,
keeps
no,
sweeping the
that's
floor, so we'll let him stay.
so transitioning into flying ag. It's obviously you have a very interesting path. You learn to fly helicopters in the military, and then kind of your first civilian crack at it is ag flying. I mean, did you at that time realize the danger of ag, or I guess not necessarily the danger, but just the intensity of flying ag, or were you a little naive to it?
I think we're doing a lot of the ride along and building time in the Huey. Definitely like showed me the gravity of it, and listening to some of the stories from that guy and his pilots. They all had stories like um, of accidents and that kind of stuff, near misses and all that stuff. So I kind of understood the gravity of it, but nobody really understands it until you have your own experiences. I can like teaching a guy how to fly. I can sit there and tell you all day how to hover, but you're not going to. It doesn't hit you until the first time that you're on the controls and you're like, "Man, this is overwhelming." So luckily, my first solo ag gig was at a guy that with a guy that was actually an air evac flight instructor at the schoolhouse for air evac, and he kind of had his own company on the side doing ag. So he was kind of a believer in a robust training program. So it wasn't just I didn't just get thrown to the wolves with that guy. He kind of let me take he went out and did a left seat right seat thing in the 44 for a little while, and then kind of got me into like, hey, go out and spray like just water only for 10 or 15 hours, get used to it. Doing it without all the external pressures. Because in ag, it's all the external pressures. Like flying the helicopter is not that big of a deal. It's all the external pressures. The customer, essentially, the customer and your boss and that kind of stuff. So
Yeah, I mean it's very much a production um, industry, right? I mean it's all about
oh
acres sprayed. Is that's
yeah,
that's money in the bank.
yeah, and there's no good way to say it, or even a better way to do it, but it's commission based pay. So your pay is directly dependent on your output. So that's, like, back to the aeromedical world real quick, uh, my ag friends don't understand that they just pay me to sit around. And if I turn down a flight, it doesn't matter. They're like, wait, you don't get paid per flight and or paid per transport. And I'm like, no, that's kind of the most unsafe way to pay somebody because it
Yeah.
incentivizes you to do things that you otherwise wouldn't, and that's kind of that kind of has it's rooted in the ag world is that everything is commission based pay. So you almost talk yourself into doing things that you normally wouldn't because your paycheck depends on it, you know.
Yeah, I would say that money is the biggest motivator of people, but it's also in aviation probably one of the leading causes of accidents.
Yeah,
Whether it's a lack of spending money on maintenance and training, or it's kind of chasing, the money. I think that I have no knowledge of this, so this is just my hypothesis. But it's like if you really broke down accidents over X period of time, you would probably just follow the money, right? And kind of see
yeah,
my business is commission only. And it's a non-flying commission only, right? But it's a sales based commission only. And to be commission only and ethical, it takes the right person. We've had people that want to join the team. I think they would be great salespeople, but I don't know if they necessarily have the ethics to be commission only, because you're exactly right. When you're commission only, you could be driven to go outside of your ethical boundaries in the business world, or in a flying sense, you could go outside of your limitations of your pilot skill or the aircraft. And sometimes you
yeah,
get away with it, right? In helicopters, you can probably do something a couple hundred times, right? Until it really bites you in the butt. So, I think people kind of, you know, get caught in that. So, uh, oh, I got a barking dog.
yeah. So on the commission based deal, just to like put it in perspective for people that aren't familiar with ag, when your commission is $4,000 a day, it's hard to take a day off.
Very.
You really convince yourself that, oh, it's going to rain tomorrow, so I'll take tomorrow off, or it's going to be too windy tomorrow, I'll take tomorrow off. And then when it comes around to it, it's like, well, that wind's not that bad. And uh, another thing for folks out there listening that maybe Part 135 or fly Part 135, Part 135 has rigid rules of like you can't fly more than 8 hours in a day. You can't fly more than so many hours in a 30-day period or a 120-day period. Part 137, which is what governs ag flying, it's the wild, wild west. It's just like everything in the United States. It seems like there's a very rigid set of rules, and then it says except for farmers. Like you need a class A CDL driver's license to drive an 80,000 pound big rig down the road. But if it's for agriculture purposes, you can drive that 120,000 pound truck down the road with a learner's permit or something because it's for agriculture. So that's kind of a shortfall too, and then you go to any industry, like no industry wants to be regulated more than they are, so it's like kind of they want to do their own thing. So it's like if you start talking to ag operators about regulation, it's like they're getting the pitchforks out.
Yeah, of course, 100%. So, I know that when you were flying air medical, you were also taking some time off during the ag season to fly ag. Obviously, very lucrative thing to do. Kind of change of pace. And I know a couple of years ago, very busy corn season, lots of flying, a lot of accidents. I think, I don't know if you know the total number, but I think at the time of your accident, you were maybe the sixth or seventh accident that I had heard about. And I really appreciate you coming on. And one of the things that I want to talk about is your accident.
Yeah.
Um, and so, I appreciate your openness to that. And, I think our listeners will appreciate that as well. When was that, 2 years ago now or three?
Uh, I think three. I'd have to look. I think it was three.
Wow, time
Yeah,
time flies.
it does.
I remember exactly where I was getting a text message from you of a balled up R66,
Yeah,
and um, and you texting me saying, I had an accident and here's the pictures. And I was mortified, but also very stoked that you were the one texting me. And I wasn't
yeah,
hearing about it from someone else because, I mean, let's be honest, it was a very severe accident. Kind of walk us through that season leading up to that day.
yeah. So, like you touched on in that time frame, there were seven wire strikes in 7 days, and that was
Ugh.
by helicopters, and that was an accident. It was a wire strike, and um, it wasn't a sneaky wire. It wasn't one that come out of a wood line to somebody's house that you couldn't see. It was a cross country power line, and it was the static discharge line at the top. That I knew was there. And you hear with a lot of wire strike accidents that I knew it was there. So my looking back on it, I have nothing to attribute my accident to other than fatigue. And like I said, going back to, and this isn't like I'm not trying to lobby against anybody or anything like that or get an industry regulated. That's not my goal at all. I'm just sharing the facts. But
Sure.
like, Part 137, there's no flight time restrictions. And like I said, commission-based aviation, commission-based pilot pay is the most conducive to accidents. So I don't have the exact figures in front of me, but it was my 13th day in a row flying, and it was the perpetual, well, it's supposed to rain tomorrow, so we'll take tomorrow off. It's supposed to be too windy tomorrow, that kind of deal. And I don't shift blame to anybody but myself. It's just as easy for me to say no as it is anybody else. But I was about 8 hours into my 13th day, and in the previous 12 days, I'd flown like 170 some odd hours. It was 14, 15 hours a day of sitting
I
in the
mean,
seat.
that's what you fly at Air Evac in a year, right?
Yeah, so
If you're lucky.
you sit back and you back on that and you're like, oh, this is obvious what happened. That was real stupid. Why did you do that? But like I said, it's like when you're in the midst of that's like from flying Air EMS, they have people from outside that can pull the plug on the operation. Like you may look at the weather and think everything's fine, and the crew thinks everything's fine, and you get a call from dispatch saying, "Hey, man, we're going to set this one out. We just don't like the way it looks." It's like the polar opposite in ag. It's like you're making all the decisions and you're immersed in the situation there. But just to kind of set it up a little bit, like I said, it was a wire I knew about. It's fatigue related, and what I learned from that accident is that apparently fatigue is a real thing. I always thought it was like a social construct. Like young people don't get tired, and we think of tired as like I'm sleepy, I want to go lay down or whatever. Uh, I tell people like when I talk to people about the accident, it was I, I didn't know this was a term at the time, but the term for what happened is microsleep. And microsleep is it's happened to all of us before. You're driving down the interstate and you kind of come about yourself and you're like mile marker 20 and you're like the last thing I remember is mile marker 5.
Yeah,
You don't remember
100%.
yeah, so it's happened to all of us. And that was essentially what happened. So I was flying a field that had terrain like rolling hills. So you couldn't see over the next hill, essentially. Like you're just flying, you're like, okay, there's the hilltop. And you couldn't see what was on the other side of the hill until you got on top of the hill. And the wires were in kind of one of those valleys of between the hilltops. And I just thought I had one more hilltop, but I was just so fatigued and mentally drained, chronically fatigued that it was an absolute surprise to me when I crested that hilltop and there were cross country power lines in my windshield.
Ugh.
And it's one of those like what there it was outside of the capabilities of the helicopter to even do anything about it. Because you go under the power lines, which is a routine thing in ag, and it's like, well, now you have a hilltop behind. You're never going to make that, and it's like max gross weight. You can't make it over the things. So, I made an effort to get over them and caught a skid tube on the static discharge line that's on the top of, like not the three big conductor wires, but the one that's, at the top of the power lines.
Sure. So it
And then
was
I was just,
actually, so you saw the line, tried to go up, and you're essentially, you got over the three main lines, but then your skid tube caught that top line.
yeah, yeah. And it just kind of stopped me dead in my tracks. I didn't even break the wire. I talked to my buddy later, months after the accident that works for a power company. He's like, yeah, man, that's half-inch stainless steel line. Like we use hydraulic bolt cutters to cut that line. He's like, you weren't making it through that.
Your little Robinson skid is not going to cut it.
Yeah, no, not happening.
So at that point, I mean, how high up is the line, and do you do you remember the accident itself, or was there a time of unconsciousness?
I'm going to say it was probably a 75 to 80 foot fall from the ground or from, to the ground. Um, I don't remember a whole lot about except I don't know. I know you have you've flown an R-66 a lot, but I don't know how much you've like went out and done more than just flying from airport to airport, that kind of stuff. But if you or you have A-Star experience too, the hydraulic transparency in the A-Star that everybody likes to talk about flying A-Stars. Well,
Yep.
66 has a similar issue. If you make an abrupt movement on the cyclic, it will kind of lock up on you for a second. It'll feel like you reached over and turned the hydraulics off. So obviously, me making a quick movement trying to climb over the thing that happened. So it's like the cyclic kind of froze up, and of course, my life depends on it at this point. So
Ugh.
I keep pulling on the thing, and the cyclic grip actually broke off. So
Wow.
that's a that's a that's a scary
That's
that's a
literally
scary
how
thing
hard
to
you were
have.
pulling.
Yeah, that's a scary thing to have happen to you. And then I just remember getting tangled up in the wires, and then looking at pictures, it kind of got stopped dead in its tracks and fell directly back, like vertical on the tail cone. That's kind of the last thing I remember until I was at the hospital. So
Man, yeah, that's wild. Do you, didn't you exit the aircraft too, but you don't necessarily like recall? Like you were not actually in the
yeah,
aircraft when they found you?
yeah, I have some vague memories of it was in a cornfield, so I knew there was no way I would be found like in a cornfield. So I have some vague memories of like trying to make it to the edge of the cornfield. I think I ended up walking down some sort of ravine or something and into like a drainage ditch, and I couldn't make it up either side, so I just kind of hung out there. And what I'm told is luckily there was another ag operator in the immediate vicinity, and his loader guy heard the accident and kind of radioed to him and was like, "Hey, I'm pretty sure a helicopter just crashed over here. Like, come over here and help me look." And so that guy is actually the one that found me. And then that's just a story I'm told. I don't even remember any of that. So
That's crazy. Were you did a helicopter come and pick you up, or were you taken by
no,
ambulance?
no. Ironically, I was taken in by ambulance. I'm not sure. Now knowing what my injuries were, like it was, textbook. I don't know why they didn't send a helicopter out there, but I went to like a small ER, um, and then they kind of stabilized me there. And then I did my only flight on a Bell 429. I was laying down in the back of it. So because they flew me from that hospital to a bigger hospital. Um, so
So you were eventually airlifted,
yeah, yeah,
and you got your
from
first.
ER to
Did
ER.
you were you coherent during your 429 ride?
No, no, I think I was a lot of drugs on board, a lot of medications. So I was stabilized at that point, but I just don't remember it. Just the only thing I remember from that flight is, because you having their medical experience, it's like, and they start hanging blood and like giving a patient blood, like it's gone to the next level. So the only thing I remember is being concerned and like asking the nurse, like, why are y'all giving me blood? Like, why have you, because that was like in my mind, I was like, oh, this must be a whole thing now. Like, it must be
Yeah,
something serious.
yeah. Like, oh, I really actually hurt myself. Is
Yeah.
that was that? That's kind of a wild experience. That you has it kind of changed the way that you look at air medical as a pilot and that patient sitting in the back. For me personally, when I was flying air medical, I tried my best to kind of disconnect myself from that person riding along because I didn't want that emergency to make me do anything to kind of push it and whatnot. I can't. What's the saying? It's like not your emergency type of deal. But
Yeah.
you have firsthand experience of the power uh, of life saving. That goes into being able to get air transported. Has it changed you at all? And kind of your appreciation, or is it just kind of it is what it is?
I think maybe like on the appreciation factor, but no, it hasn't changed a whole lot about how, like you said, how I approach doing the job. Because, like, and you know how it is, they want you to kind of disassociate from that, and not to get too far into it, but that's kind of a really big thing between when a military pilot comes into civilian flying, especially EMS. It's two completely different mentalities. Like I did the equivalent of air EMS in the Army, overseas in Iraq, and it was like the mindset there is like we're all going to put our life on the line to go get that guy. Whereas it's the complete opposite on the civilian side. It's like
100%.
our three lives are not to be put at risk to save this person that's already having, a bad day. So anyway, that was kind of a tangent, but yeah, that's it didn't not a whole lot. I still kind of approach the job with the same mentality, but um, yeah, that experience does kind of the gravity of what you're doing is greater, but not how I really approach doing the job.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I appreciate you talking about it. I know that talking about those types of experiences, specifically on a public forum, is intense to
Yeah,
say the least. So I appreciate you talking about it, and I think that as aviation, we're all in this together. We're all in the helicopter industry together, and I do agree that we do see a lot of consistent accidents within 137 work, specifically driven by what you said, commission based, pays, uh, no time restraints, no consecutive day limits, things like that. I would like to probably see, some things kind of start to change because, seven wire strikes in 7 days to me is like an unacceptable figure. To me, like that's a systemic issue. And for our listeners out there, I'm not just saying this to butter Jackie up. Jackie is one of the most responsible professional pilots that I've had the pleasure of knowing and working with. And so for him to have this accident, to me that means anyone could have this accident because Jackie, you truly are very much a professional aviator. And so, I think it's really an illuminating thing, and to hear that you had that accident made me think like, man, if it's happening to him, it could literally happen to anyone. At the end of the day, what were the actual injuries that were sustained?
uh, I had seven broken ribs, a punctured lung, and a punctured spleen.
Ooh,
So yeah, I think it was fortunately it was all blunt force trauma, and I don't really know where. Never really was able to piece back like what I hit, any of that kind of stuff. I will tell you, it's wearing a helmet. That's a lot of most ag guys will wear a helmet, and the doctor like looking at because I believe they took my helmet with me, because that's kind of a common thing in the medical field. Like they want to see like how bad somebody's helmet was, or protective gear was
sure.
damaged. And the doctor was like, "Hey, no doubt in my mind, if you weren't wearing a helmet, like you would have been donezo." So I don't know what my helmet hit, but um, so yeah, so that was a big factor is I was wearing a helmet. But kind of what you were just saying, there's a a widely acknowledged thing in the ag community is that, and it can be said about the entire helicopter industry or aviation as a whole, but every ag guy flies with this in the back of their mind. It doesn't matter if you've been doing the job 20 minutes or 20 years, like today could be your day, like it doesn't matter if you made it 20 years without an accident, like today could be it. And it doesn't matter what you fly. If you're out there flying single engine EMS, like yeah, 20 years and the engine's never coughed on you once, but today could be the day that it quits.
Totally. Yeah, I
So
mean it's yeah, you never know when your ticket's going to be punched. I think in certain operations, there's obviously a highly likelihood. I would almost argue in ag, it's not like if but when type of situation, just because of the environment. It's not always wires. I know there's lots of you're flying low level mechanical failures. I know a handful of operators that had issues where it was kind of more of a forced landing, not so much a wire strike. But
yeah.
Jackie, I'm stoked that you're okay. I'm glad that you're talking about it. Obviously, you did hang up the ag helmet, though. Is that correct?
Yeah, I haven't flown any ag since then. Yeah, and not so. I really enjoy that work, the utility side of stuff. Um, I don't have any aversion going back to it. Um, but I have a 4-year-old daughter and a wife that
Totally.
has a lot of that has a lot of objection to it. So, you know, that's kind of where I stand on that right now. Like I don't have any ill will towards that industry. I love that industry. I enjoy doing that kind of work. And if all things were equal, that's the work I would do. But obviously, all things are not equal. So,
Yeah, and I mean that's I've talked about it on the show before. Being a helicopter pilot, especially when you're married and have children, it's a balancing act.
yeah,
You have to pick and choose. I would love to go and have a heli torch hanging from my helicopter doing controlled burns and be gone for 6 months, 7 months at a time. I don't think my wife would like that. And so
yeah,
you have to kind of take those things into account. And obviously, the accident for you was not only a jarring experience for you, but probably a very scary experience for your wife, especially at that time, having a 1 year old. So, I'm sure as I am, she's extremely thankful to have you. And probably I can definitely see her being like, yeah, no more ag.
yeah, for sure.
I think that's fair. I think that's a fair deal. But Jackie, again, I appreciate you talking about it, um, and I appreciate you coming on. Jackie Sanders, again, this guy is awesome. I'm very fortunate to know this guy, and I do actually feel like he helped me get through a lot of the air medical training. I had some I guess I could say I just a lack, maybe a little bit of a lack of confidence during that whole training program, and I relied heavily on Jackie and the other guys in my group to kind of, support me to get me through. And I think we all kind of supported each other. So I appreciate that. I appreciate you coming on. Are you on Hitch
Yeah.
right now?
I'm on night hitch right now.
Oh
So,
man, did you fly last night?
no, we kind of had a weather night last night, and then I think I think we maybe had a service tonight. So I don't think we have a full crew tonight. So maybe those are we were talking about earlier. Those are the best nights because the radio doesn't even go off. So
Those, yeah,
those are
those
the
are the
ones that make it
best.
those are the ones that make it worth it because you're just kind of getting paid to hang out with your bros.
It was always my luck though. I would hear at like 1 o'clock, get a text from like the day pilot, and he'd be like, "Hey, just so you know, we're out of service tonight." And then it's almost like this weight is kind of lifted off you, and you feel great. And you get into the base, and you get a call from your RDFO, and they're like, "Hey, we're gonna send you over to Laredo."
Yeah,
Uh,
we
and you're like,
we we
"No."
we need you to get in your car and drive 2 hours to the west and cover that
Yeah,
base.
yeah, exactly.
Appreciate it.
So,
Yeah.
well, Jackie, thank you so much for coming on. Again, to our listeners, thank you so much for supporting the Helicopter Podcast and checking it out. Remember, new episodes every Tuesday are launched, and we are doing video now. And so please go ahead and find me on YouTube. You can like and subscribe and put on your notifications so anytime a new video is dropped, you get notified. And if you're on YouTube or you're on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, whatever it is, if you like the show, please share your feedback. If there's things that you would want to see better, share that feedback too. Reviews are not only good for helping me get more traction, but it also helps me kind of hone the craft and make sure that I'm tailoring the podcast to those of you who are listening. So thank you, Jackie, for joining. And to our audience, thanks for listening to another Helicopter Podcast. See ya.